In this video, let's talk about JavaScript dates and why most people don't understand how to work with them. So if I go to my JavaScript console right now and use this new date constructor to get a date, like this, if I hit enter, see, I'll get this. It says Saturday, July 9th, 2022, and it's 11:18 p.m., so Central Time. If I'm in a different location, let's say I'm in Los Angeles or in West Coast someplace, and I do the same thing, and I just go ahead and do new date, I do this, and I hit enter, I'm gonna get July 9th, 2022, 9:19 Pacific Daylight Time. So basically, I'm getting the date and time in that time zone where I'm located for that browser. So let's get back to this and look at something else. So I'm going to go ahead and save this in a variable like this. And yet again, if I just look inside of that variable, at the moment, it will be whatever that time is in that time zone and the date. Now, if I go ahead and do .get time on this, and it's a method, and if I go ahead and run this, you'll see I'll get this. And what this is the offset of some starting point. So the way in most computer programs or programming languages we deal with dates, there are really no real dates. Everything is a number, which is an offset from some sort of starting point. So that offset could be in seconds, milliseconds, days, hours, and it's different depending on what you're dealing with. Now, in JavaScript, they do it in milliseconds. That's the unit they use. So this is number of milliseconds from some starting point. So if I just grab this number for a second, let's just open some spreadsheet and grab this number right there. If I take that number, so in 1 second we have 1000 milliseconds, right? So if I go ahead now, take this and divide it by that 1000, now this would be the number of seconds at this point from our starting point. Now we can then further divide by 60, right? So if that was the number of seconds divided by 60, now we're getting the number of minutes. So at that point, we can just go ahead and do this math really quickly here. So we can take this and then divide it by this and then further divide it by this. And this will be the number of minutes. And now if we then divide it by 60 again, so this will be divided by this, divided by this, divided by this. So now we're looking at number of hours from that starting point, right? So you can then decide what you're gonna do. You can then divide this by 24 because we have 24 hours per day to get number of days from the starting point and so on. But in this case, this is milliseconds. So if you want to convert it to seconds, you're going to have to divide it by 1000. After that, you're dealing with seconds, so you can decide how you want to deal with that from that point on. Now, the key thing to understand here is that if I now go to my browser again and go ahead and do another one of these, so I'm going to do const d1 this time and do d1.getTime, I will get the new number of milliseconds from that starting point. And the key thing to understand, if I could run the same code in my browser in different time zones, I would still be getting the same number because the starting point for this is usually set in a particular time zone. So let's just do one more time. I'm going to try to kind of do fast in both time zones to see It's not going to be the exact same number, but it should be pretty close because we're very close in time, right? So I'm going to do get time and do this. Now, if we run that same code in a different time zone, it's not going to be the same exact time, but it's going to be pretty close because I ran it very close to one another, right? So if we compare, this is the number in this time zone, which is Pacific time. And then I do that same number, I grab it from Central. So these are those two timestamps I got. Now this is again in milliseconds. So if I divide both of these numbers by 1,000, that's going to be the number of seconds difference between this and this. And you can see that the numbers are actually pretty close. This is like 082, this was 066. So we're looking at, if I just do the math between this and this, about 15.8 seconds difference. That's how long it took me to run the same code in the other browser in a different time zone. But if I could run both at the same time, this number would have been the same. And that's the key thing to understand. So when we do that new date, we actually get formatted time. So it gives us formatted time in our particular time zone that we're in. But our timestamps are the same because we're located at the same point at time, even though it could be even different days depending which location you're in, but our timestamp is the same at the same time. And that's the reason why when you want to deal with times, generally speaking, you want to deal with timestamps because with these you can do calculations. So if you wanted to calculate the difference between two dates, how do we do that calculation? Because realistically, there's no way to calculate the difference in dates. However, we can calculate the difference between numbers, and then we can convert those numbers to dates. Now, before we get to any calculations, let's actually go back and figure out what's that starting point in JavaScript that it considers the starting point in time, right? So if I go back to my browser here and do a new date, and then as a starting time, I'm going to pass a 0 here. And if I hit enter, you'll see I got Wednesday, December 31st, 1969, and that would be, see, 1800. And we're talking about Central Time. This tells me that their starting point is actually 1970. So they're starting the beginning of their time in JavaScript at 1970. Now, the reason I'm getting 1969 with this 1800 is because my time that I'm in now is Central Time, and that's basically -6 to GMT. So in GMT, if it was 1970, 12 a.m., because we're -6 in Chicago, it would still be 1969, the previous year, and it would be 1800. We just figured out that the starting point in JavaScript, let's just write this down, is 1970 GMT 0. Let's actually write it down as January 1st, 1970, and this is all in GMT 0. So any time we get is that many milliseconds from that starting point. Now this starting point, depending again on the language or the software you use or whatever else you use, is probably going to be a different thing, a different start time, and the units could be different too. Now in JavaScript, it's milliseconds as units. Now you could deal with some other times, like maybe Unix times or whatever other times, And you could find out that the units are seconds instead of milliseconds, and maybe your starting time is not January 1st, 1970, but they picked a different starting point. But the logic is going to be the same. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages of having different units and different starting times or whatever. And what is a good thing today may not be the best option in 10 years. But nevertheless, with JavaScript, we're dealing with this starting point, GMT 0, and its milliseconds as our offset. Basically, long story short, when I go right now in my browser and do a new date, and then on that I do get time. Now, whether that get time method name is a good choice, that's open for discussion. But nevertheless, when I get this number, it basically tells us that right now it's this many milliseconds after this. Now, we can create dates in two different ways. We can either create dates, well, actually more than two different ways, but we can create a date by simply just doing new date, which basically gives you the current date and time. And if I do get time, that will give you the timestamp of that date. Or we can create a new date by passing that number of milliseconds offset from that starting point. And this is why when I did 0, that was 0 offset, so it gave us the beginning of their time. But if I pass, for example, this number here, it will give us that same time that we got here. Because now I'm creating that date past that many milliseconds from our starting point. Let's see if we can do a negative number. So what happens if I take minus and let's go back in time, right? So if I wanted to go back in time, let's say 2 hours from that starting point, it would be what? 1000 milliseconds times 60. So that would be a minute. And then I'm going to do times 60. And that would be hours. And then if I do times 2, we should have 2 hours. So if I enter, you'll see that I'm going to get 1969, 1600. And if you remember, when I did the 0, it was 1969, 1800. So now we went 2 hours back here because I went negative number here in milliseconds. And if I go positive, it will be 2 hours later. For example, let's just go back and redo this and change that negative to a positive. So now it's going to go 2 hours after that. And you can see we got 8 p.m. And if I go 4 more hours later, so it's going to be instead of 2, 6. So 6 hours from that beginning time, we're going to end up at this 0 time in standard Chicago time. So now hopefully all of this is making sense. So if we wanted to calculate the difference between two different dates. So for example, if I have a date right now, and if I just go ahead and enter that date and get the timestamp of that date, that would be this. And let's just go ahead and put that in a spreadsheet. I'm going to call it start time. Let's actually get what is this in more human readable time. So we'll just go ahead and do a date using that time offset. So we'll take that, pass that milliseconds I got above, and that should tell us what date and time it was if we want it more readable. And that would be this basically. So I'm going to just copy that. Let's just enter that in our spreadsheet too. So this is our basically start time. Now, at some point, we're going to get some end time. It could be in a few minutes. It could be in a few seconds. It could be in a few years. Let's just go get some time. Our time is not going to be that much different because I'm doing it right now at this point, right? But we could also just create times in the future and use those. Now let's just go ahead and grab some real-time thing now, a little later, so we can kind of get an idea how this works. So if I go back now, a little time went by and I do another new date get time, I'm going to get another timestamp. This is my new timestamp, which is going to be what I'm going to consider my end time. And let's just paste that right in here so that we got that number. And let's just create a human readable thing here so we can see what that looks like. I'm going to copy that and put it in our spreadsheet. So at this point, if you are looking at this, this was 23:36:03. This is 37. So it's 1 minute and 39 seconds after that, right? We can look at this with our eyes and kind of figure out what that difference is. But how do we do this calculation? So what do? We take the end timestamp minus the start timestamp and do the difference. So if I do this minus the other one, it will tell us this is how many milliseconds difference we're dealing with. So if I want this in seconds, then I need to get this and divide it by not 60, 1000. Let's not trust the Google Sheets autocomplete. So 1000 because we have 1000 milliseconds in 1 second. So now it says there was 98.65 seconds difference between the start and end time. At this point, if I wanted to get that difference in, say, minutes, then we can take this and divide it by 60 because we got 60 seconds in 1 minute. And now we get 1.64 minutes. Now, one thing you need to understand is that when you get 1.64, it's not 1 minute and 64 seconds. It's 0.64 minutes. So if I just do a rough calculation here and we do 0.644 and I multiply it by 60 because we have 60 seconds per minute, it would be 38.64 seconds. So that's really the seconds. So it's 1 minute and 38 seconds between those two things. So you could obviously do all of these calculations in JavaScript, but the key thing, again, to understand is that we're going to have to use the timestamps to get that difference. So if I go back and do that here, so I had this date that gives us this, and this date that gives us this. The same exact two. Let's actually save those in a variable so we can use them. So I'm going to go ahead and create a constant here, call it D1. I think I had a D1 already. Let's just use it T1 for this. Make it equal this. And let's create another one here. And that's going to be our T2. Where is that one? It's going to be probably this one right here. So at this point, if I look at T1, that is this. And if I look at T2, that's that. Now I can calculate the difference between these two. So I can create a difference. And this difference is going to be in milliseconds. And for that, we're going to take the later time, which is going to be this T2 in our case, and do get time to get that milliseconds, minus, we're going to take T1 and do get time to again get that difference in milliseconds. So at this point, if I enter, if I just look at that difference in milliseconds, it should be that same number are calculated in my spreadsheet. So if we go back and take a look, 98,650, that's this number right here. So we got our difference in milliseconds at this point. So now if I want to get this in seconds, I will have to take that difference in milliseconds and divide it by 1,000. And now if I check that difference in seconds, that's how many seconds it is, 98.65. Now again, if you want difference in minutes, then we're going to take that and divide it by 60. So we're going to take difference in seconds and divide it by 60. And now if I do difference in minutes, so we can see what that is, it's that 1.64 number. So let's take two other dates and try to do our calculation so we can see how does that work in like days and hours and something like that, right? I'll grab one of the ones I already have. So I have like T1. This gives us this date and time. Let's grab some date in future. So let's do const T3 and make it equal new date. And for this, I'm just gonna pass some string 2022-July 19th, like this, right? So if I do this and hit enter, it should create another date and time. Let's try to get the timestamp of that. So if I do T3 and do .getTime, that will be our number of milliseconds now. So I'm going to copy that. So if I go back to our spreadsheet for a second, I'm going to put that here as my end time now being this. Let's actually go grab what that actual date and time is so we can register a nicer looking date time here. So one thing I want you to notice here is that this date that I've created here using the string format, it says July 19th. And if I look at what time it picked up 1900 and it picked up July 18th in this time zone that I'm in. So when I'm creating a date like this with a string, it's creating that again in that GMT 0 time. Just so you know what's happening here. I'm just going to copy it here and transfer that to my spreadsheet. So now if I want to calculate that difference, well, I already have the milliseconds here, this minus this. Then I have this one, divides it by 1,000 to get number of seconds. And then I have this, it's number of minutes. Now, if I want number of hours, I will have to take that and divide it by 60 again. So that's the number of hours, 211 hours. So how do we then convert that to days? We have 24 hours per day. So then we're going to take this and divide it by 24. And that would be 8.8 days difference between those two. So if you look here, we got July 9th and July 18th, 9 days here, but it's a little less than 9 because we had this being already like 11 p.m. and this one is a lot earlier on July 18th. So that's a little less than 9 days difference. And again, you would do those same calculations in your code instead of doing that in the spreadsheet. So I'm not going to go over that here. But the last thing I do want to go over is what if you want to create a date here using some sort of string, but you want this to go in your current time zone. Because if you remember, when I did this, it created this in GMT time. So first, let's take a look at something here. So I'm going to just go back here and take that T3 and do something like let's do JSON. So you can see here, toJSON gives us this format of time, which will be basically the date and then T, and then it gives us the hour, seconds, and milliseconds here, and then Z in the end. Probably that's UTC. So let's just go back here and do see, we have ISO string or toGMT string. So let's just do those two. So I'm going to do this. And then we got our ISO string, which seems to be the same as our toJSON method. Let's see if we got any other methods here that we can use to get like printable time. Let's also do this UTC string. So UTC is going to be actually the one that we're basing everything on, starting from 0 time here. So if you look here, Central Time is GMT minus 5. So if I instantiate a date here, let's just get that new date. I'm not going to save it in a variable here. We'll change the string a little bit, add t, and let's do 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And if I look at what it's going to create, if I enter, if you look, it created July 19th, 2022, but now it's 0 in Central Time. So if I pass it in this format, it creates it in my current date and time in my browser. So let's go ahead and run this in Pacific Daylight Time and see what happens. And here, as you can see, it created that date and time right here in Pacific Daylight Time. But yet again, if I didn't do the t and the time and I did it in this format, just the date, then it goes to that UTC 0, and then it creates our time, which is now July 18th. So if you want to create a date using string in that particular environment time zone, you can pass it in this format, and that should work for you. That being said though, this method of passing strings may not be very safe in different environments. So when you do this new date and you pass some sort of string, for example, if we do July 10, something like that, if we do it just like this, we figured out it's going to do this in UTC 0 time, which makes it a different date in our current Chicago time. And then we could do this to pass some sort of time. Let's say we want to do 10 p.m. And that worked out to do it in our current Chicago time. But a safer way to do this is to use another option in this constructor for a date, which will basically start with your date. So if I wanted to recreate this, that would be 2022, the year, comma. So now we're going to be using numbers. The weird thing about this constructor is that the month part is going with indexes. So what I mean by that, if I want to do July, if I do 7, it's going to do August because the month index for this starts from 0. So January is 0, then February is 1, then 2. So basically with that, this July would be 6, not 7, comma. Then we have the day, and days don't have 0 index though. So with a day, you would do 10. So at this point, that would be July 10. Then I can do comma, and then we have the hour. So 10 again. Then we got the minute, then we got 0 being the time. So at this point, if I hit enter, you'll see I get another date similar to this one, which gives me in my current time zone, this particular date. You can basically pass a part of this. So if I, for example, didn't pass the time here and only did this first beginning part, that would basically create in my current time zone, see 0. So 12 a.m. in my time zone, not UTC time zone this time. And if I do, for example, this, so we got July 1st now. So we basically default to the beginning of whatever we set. So you do want to be careful though, is not to do this and expect that to be the first day in 2022, because if you do this, if you remember, now it's going to interpret that number, if we only have one number, as a timestamp offset from our beginning of time. You have to at least provide a month here too. So if I want to do like the first day in a year, I would do 0 as January. Now we got like January 1st. So one last thing I guess worth to mention here is that you have one more argument here for milliseconds. So right now I'm doing 10 p.m. So if I wanted to do 10:15 like this and then 20 seconds, that would be this. But you also have milliseconds after the comma. So if you wanted to do 350 milliseconds, you can do so. So that would be basically a safer way to make a date in your current environment time zone. So let's create another date object here. Make it a new date. Now, if I do t1 dot, we're going to get the methods on this date object. From this date object, you could do a bunch of things. You could get the year from that object. If you just want a number for the year, you can get the month. And again, you want to remember that the way months work, it starts with indexes. So July is really 6, so January is 0. And then we got get day, which will give you the day, and so on. So I encourage you to explore some of these methods to just get familiar with them, what they do. So you can see we get minutes, milliseconds, hours, etc. The parts that could be interesting here is some of the set functions here. So you can see we have like set year, set hours, set month, set minutes, etc. So let's do an example of that so you can see how that works. So if I do, for example, T1 right here, see we got our July 10th and it gives us the time. And then if we do set and then do set full year, so right now you can see how we're in 2022. Now, if I just change this to 2024, hit enter. Now, if we go check what's in that T1, you can see that it's the same day, same time, same everything else, except that we changed the year to 2024. And that same sort of thing happens with all of the set stuff. So if we do set month, again, remember this goes by the index. So if I want to change this July to January, that would be 0. So if I do this and then check what's that date, so you can see now we became January 10th, 2024. And then the last thing I'm going to go over really quickly is how to get the same thing tomorrow or how to get the same thing yesterday. And you should already kind of know how to do this based on my explanation in the beginning. So for example, if I do another constant here and do a new date here just to get this, and we can see what's going on here. So that will be this. So now if I wanted to get tomorrow, the same date and same time, same everything, what I have to do is basically figure out how many milliseconds I have to add to this. If we have 1000 milliseconds per second, and then we do 60 seconds, that would be a minute. And then we multiply it by 60. Now we got an hour. And then we multiply it by 24. We will get our number. So this is the number of milliseconds we got in a single day. So if we basically take that T2 and do get time, and then add that number of milliseconds from here, we will get this number. And using this number, if we now make a date, that would be tomorrow. So you can see that should be the same everything, only it went one day after. So if you wanted yesterday, you would do minus that same number. And in 2 days would be 2 times that number. You can see how this works. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video.